Thank you. Well, good morning. I'm Jim Barron. I'm a professor of management at SOM, and I have the privilege of welcoming you all to this panel on managing creative talent. Before we kind of get down to business, I just want to take a second and thank a whole bunch of people who've worked unbelievably hard kind of behind the scenes to make this thing work. Abby Roth in the Dean's office, who kind of masterminded the whole deal. Ben Madison, who I saw somewhere, Ben, who has kind of been the liaison between the school and our distinguished panelists. Joe DeLillo, who just walked out of the room. Okay. He apparently has the title during these proceedings of the room lieutenant, but given the job he's done, it's just a matter of time before he becomes room major. And Bob Mendelson and the IT people. You all should understand that for those of us on the faculty, it's a little bit like we've been driving a Pinto for 40 years and all of a sudden in front of you been given a Bugatti to try to handle. So they've been very helpful with the IT. And finally, my colleagues, Rob Bartholomew and Tony Dini, who, as usual, have worked really, really hard to try to...
There's a discussion going on, yes.
To try to keep me from either embarrassing or injuring myself. So I don't know, we may get to hear some other panels as well, which... It's probably worth noting at the outset that had Evans Hall been constructed...
Okay, very good.
Are we all going to be getting commentary back?
This reminds me of the time I taught at Stanford and a heckler came into the classroom and was just yelling random stuff. So had this building been constructed at the time that many buildings on campus were, it's unlikely that the opening celebration would have included a panel devoted to this topic, particularly one called Managing Creative Talent. That's a topic that actually has become of interest, but fairly recently. Those of you that have played around with Google's Ngram feature know that you can plot phrases in terms of how often they've occurred in the 5.2 million books that Google has chosen to digitize. And so I just picked a bunch of words that came after the word employee and have plotted those since the 1940s. And what you see is that the proliferation of interest in employee creativity is really quite striking. Not on this slide, but it even trumps employee engagement, which has to be one of the kind of most used buzzwords in the HR world these days. So it's pretty clear that lots and lots of people are interested in this topic, and increasingly so over time. So we are incredibly fortunate to have four very distinguished folks with us today, and four very thoughtful folks who've given a lot of thought to the questions involved in managing creative talent. Notwithstanding a lot of diversity among them, there's at least three things that they have in common that made them attractive targets for this thankless task that I've twisted their arm to do. Each of them is in a senior and broad management role that I would characterize as fundamentally being about understanding, increasing, and harnessing the creative energies of their employees, and in Mr. Eden's case, as you'll see, the employees of his clients. Second, each of them, like most of us, works in a context where intellectual labor and innovation are paramount. And so tapping the diverse knowledge and experiences of employees is fundamental. And oftentimes, the people whom you're trying to manage know much more about the subject than you do. And then third, as is evidenced by their appearance here today, each of them has continued to be an enormously generous and loyal contributor both to Yale and to SOM in many, many ways. Let me briefly introduce them and then get out of the way so that we can get to the fun part. On my immediate right is Beth Axelrod, a 1989 graduate of SOM, who is currently the Senior Vice President and Chief Human Resource Officer at a little company called eBay, at which she oversees all aspects of the company's people capabilities across what's an enormously creative and demanding workforce. I know at lunch my wife is eager to pick your brain. She was one of the early eBay employees, so I know she's eager to learn how things have calmed down since the time that she was there. Like several folks on this panel before that, she did a stint at McKinsey, during which time she co-authored an enormously influential report called The War for Talent. To her right is Laura Walker, a 1987 alumna of SOM, who is president and CEO of New York Public Radio, a portfolio of media properties that reaches more than 11 million people every month. And not too long ago, she was named by Cranes as one of New York City's most powerful women, which would seem like a tough category to get into. To her right is Jock Reynolds, who is the Henry Heinz director of the Yale University Art Gallery, as well as a highly acclaimed artist himself. In addition to managing the talents of the Yale Gallery staff, he's also challenged on a day-to-day basis of trying to harness the creative talents of the Yale student body, for whom the resources he oversees are an important part of their learning experience. If you've walked around the building, you've also seen a testament to his tremendous contribution in helping make Evans Hall a place that not only houses great architecture and ideas and people, but great art as well. And last, but by no means least, to his right, Jeremy Eden, who is a graduate both of Yale College in 1978 and of SOM in 1986, and currently a member of our board of advisors. He's co-founder and co-CEO of Harvest Earnings Group, and as you will hear, he believes that for most organizations, if you add up all the little tiny improvements that could be made, if all the employees were willing and able to take advantage of everything they know, you may have heard Jeff Bucas refer to this very thing this morning, there are mind-boggling opportunities for improvement.
And that was my speech. Thank you very much.
So to get us started, I asked each of our panelists if they would take a few minutes to give us their broad perspective with regard to managing creative talent. Everybody among us agreed that leaving lots of time for cross-communication and for communication and Q&A is important, so we're going to be relatively brief in the first stage. And here specifically is the question that I asked them to speak to. What does creative talent mean or look like in your organization? In other words, where in the enterprise do creativity and talent reside? How do they manifest themselves? What practices have you found most effective in harvesting them? And what challenges do you face in this domain? And to start us off, Beth Axelrod.
Can I have the, thank you. Thanks. So thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be here with the panel and with all of you to celebrate this grand occasion. So I'm going to talk to you about creative talent at eBay, and specifically I'm going to talk about product and technology innovation, although creativity exists in many forms in our company. And I want to start just by giving you a little context about the business, because it's important to understand why innovation's important in our company. So eBay was founded in 1995 by Pierre Omidyar on the simple idea that by connecting buyers and sellers, we could create economic opportunity all around the world for people. And so since that time, eBay has grown with, based on our latest reported numbers, which were 2012, to be a $14 billion revenue company. That revenue is primarily from our two core businesses, eBay and PayPal. eBay has 124 million active users, $81 billion worth of gross merchandise volume. There are 500 million items for sale on eBay sites all around the world. If you haven't used eBay lately, you might be surprised to know that 70% of those items are actually new, not used. And 70% of those items actually sell for a fixed price as opposed to an auction format. PayPal has 137 million accounts around the world and $169 billion worth of total payment volume. PayPal does business in 193 countries around the world and transacts in 26 different currencies. And I give you those, and then we have eBay Enterprise, which enables brands and retailers to transact online. So I give you that just as context for what the sort of global complexity is of the business. And innovation is extremely important to our business because of the nature of the space in which we compete. And there are 4 major trends right now that are converging that are putting a premium on the importance of innovation, namely local, mobile, social, and digital. And the convergence of those 4 trends is changing the way people shop and the way people pay. And it is blurring the line between online and offline shopping. So today you might go online and purchase something, but choose to pick it up in the store. Or you might go in the store to look at something, but take out your smartphone, look at prices elsewhere, and choose to buy it online. And so with that line blurring and with consumer behavior changing so rapidly, we have to innovate with speed in order to keep pace with consumer needs, but also the external environment in which we compete. And so what I want to do is I want to share with you several different examples of innovation and the different ways that that innovation happens in our company, because our learning around innovation is that it doesn't happen in a single way, but we have to nurture it in many different ways. And I thought a good place to start would actually be with mobile, because the innovation in mobile has been extraordinary. So today people shop using many different devices, and mobile devices are an important part of people's shopping experience. Back in 2007, we hired a very seasoned executive to build our mobile business, and to build a mobile business that, of course, didn't exist. And so it was in anticipation of mobile being important. And we built it on the side, outside of the core, with a small team that was responsible for creating new, unimaginable, up till that time, shopping experiences. And so they built the first eBay iPhone app. In fact, the story behind that is an engineer was asked to build that app, build an iPhone app, and he said, "What's an iPhone?" So in 2007, of course, when the iPhone was invented, none of us knew what that experience was going to be like. And here's the story of the success and consumer adoption of mobile shopping. So in 2008, eBay, transacted $192 million worth of commerce volume on mobile devices. And we anticipate for 2013 that the number will be $20 billion worth of merchandise volume on devices that were transacted on eBay properties. That's just our portion of the total market share. And if any of you are not mobile shoppers and are wondering what is it that people are actually buying on their mobile devices, it is literally everything you can imagine. We sell about 13,000 cars per week on mobile devices, the most expensive of which was an Enzo Ferrari that sold for $2.7 million on a mobile device. So if ever there was an example about consumers adopting new ways of shopping. And mobile has enabled us to innovate in different ways. So this is an example of innovation that happens through a core group that we have whose only job it is to innovate. It's to imagine new technologies that haven't yet been developed and to create them. This is a shoppable window. So you see the people standing in front of a full life-size window that enables them to shop. But what's important from a retailer perspective is it's changing the functionality of retail space. It's enabling people to shop at times when the retailer isn't open. And it's enabling the retailer to show inventory that may not even be on display inside the store. And so this happens through our innovation team. Another example of innovation, this is innovation that happens through the core product organization of PayPal, just trying to imagine different ways that we might all want to pay when we're in a retail establishment. So in this case, this enables you to just check in on your mobile device by dropping a PIN. And once you've done that with a retailer who is PayPal enabled, rather than using cash or plastic to pay, you can actually with one click pay through your PayPal account. So this is an example of innovation that's happened through the product organization of PayPal. And the last innovation example I wanted to give you happened through our organization. In our company, we have 2 handfuls of people that we've identified as really exceptional entrepreneurs. They meet quarterly with our CEO specifically for the purpose of identifying opportunities to innovate on things that aren't otherwise being considered in the organization. So they got together and they looked at, this is an old eBay experience. So as you can see from this slide, this person happened to like vintage posters. And they said, you know what, there are better ways to create a more personalized experience for people. So they decided to go away and build a new, more personalized experience. The 2 people who were part of that discussion are both product managers. They decided the best way to do this was to go to Australia. And the reason was they decided that by going to Australia, nobody would be able to reach them during regular business hours because it was the other side of the planet. This is a true story. They called up 3 engineers and 1 designer and said, we're leaving for Australia tomorrow to build an incredible new product. Do you want to come? And they all 4 said yes. Got on a plane the next day, went to Australia, went online to Airbnb, rented a house, lived together, worked day and night, and came back 2 weeks later with what we call the feed, which is the new homepage that about 60% of all eBay users now use, that enables each of us to go online, identify our interests, and to receive a feed. So this is a still screenshot, but if we could scroll through it, you would see item after item after item that this particular individual has identified as being of interest to him or her. And so when I stepped back from all of those examples and tried to capture for you, well, how do we enable innovation at eBay? We do it through multiple mechanisms. But a few things that are particularly important to innovation for us is, first of all, openness and trust of leaders to allow people to experiment and do new things. And then strong executive sponsorship when it comes time to actually test products, because when you have over 100 million users on a single global platform, you need sponsorship to try new things on the site. We believe in kind of the spirit of less is more on the teams. It's kind of a Silicon Valley term, is the 2 pizza team. If there are more people on the team than you can feed with 2 pizzas, you've got too many people on the team. And so we go for small, very courageous, high caliber teams for our product and technology innovation that typically have product managers, engineers, and designers on them. And they show up with a focus on the customer to create simple and functional products and use a philosophy of just rapid iteration, fail fast, figure out what works. If it doesn't work, move on to the next thing. And because we are a global platform and a technology-enabled business and a complicated matrix, clarity of decision rights around who gets to decide so that the innovation does not wither on the vine, but we can get to quick decisions to enable the innovation to surface is really important. And I said respect for the core, because it's easy in a business like ours to be enamored with the bright, shiny innovation that's off to the side. But every day, it's the core and the people who work in the core that deliver on behalf of our customers. And so a very clear articulation around respect for the core while we also respect our innovation. And then finally, just many avenues for innovation. So every example I gave you was born out of a different forum for innovation. And in addition to those forums, we have forums that enable all employees at eBay to innovate. We have what we call skunk works and lab rats, where every employee can bring forth their innovation. We pick the best ones, we fund them, and we bring them live to site. We also use open source code that enables us to tap into people who are very innovative but not our employees. We have thousands of developers who develop on our code base. And so many avenues of innovation are what's working for us. And I'll just wrap by saying that it's very important for us as a global company to find ways to inspire all of our people. We don't necessarily expect every single one of them to innovate, but we do want to inspire them all. And we inspire them with what we call our shared purpose, which is called connected commerce, creating more opportunity together. And this is the articulation of the difference we try to make in the world, and it is the way that we inspire all 31,500 of our people around the globe. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say to my colleagues that if you can't find me on Monday, I will have gone to Australia.
I know.
Wonderful policy. Laura.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's a great idea. Well, we are not anywhere near as big as eBay, but face many of the same challenges. We are New York Public Radio. We're a $60 million nonprofit. We produce a number of national and local public radio programs, Freakonomics Radio, Radio Lab. Here's the Thing with Alec Baldwin, On the Media, Studio 360, and we have a large and growing New York newsroom. But before I came to SOM, in my 20s, I was actually a journalist, and I was also a producer, and I thought I was on the creative side of the business, right? And the other side, the business side, was the boring side, and it couldn't possibly be creative. And one of the things I learned, certainly at SOM, was that there's creativity very much creativity on the business side, and particularly on the strategic side. And now, as I sit kind of atop the, this public radio kind of organization, I hear a lot of the people on the business side talk about managing the talent. And managing the talent always means, managing the big egos and the folks that, have large public followings and are hard to deal with. But I think it really is, there is creativity certainly that is needed and exists on both the business and the creative side. And so we have to think very hard about how we, as a relatively small organization, but serving a large and global audience, how we can innovate in every way. And as Jeff said earlier, and as was mentioned about eBay, the media world, it is about local, it's about mobile. There's so much happening. It's about downloading content, and we have to be very innovative. So I want to focus on 4 kind of observations coming from my experience. The first is that I think, and this seems very obvious, but it becomes very important. It is way better to have one great employee than 2 or 3 mediocre employees. So hiring well is really, really important. And when it comes to creativity, one of the things that we have found is that what we look for and what we think about is people who are both really comfortable with ambiguity and can deal with this fast-changing environment we're in, but at the same time have the skills and the structure and the ability to kind of put structure and discipline around a process. And that, that's come from kind of thinking hard and having some, some failures and some successes. And, it is, I think, in the digital age, our most important resource is human. And so we need to be very thoughtful about how we hire. The second is to create a culture that really does respect the creative culture. There is, as I said before, a lot of ambiguity in a creative struggle. If you're creating a new show or you're trying to figure out, how to get those emails from Chris Christie or whatever you're doing, there's a fair amount of, trying and failing, and it's something that Jad Abumrad, who's the creator of Radiolab, he talks about this as gut churn. Those feeling when he was creating Radiolab, it's that kind of feeling we all know, a vulnerable, kind of sick to your stomach feeling like your life is in danger. The uncertainty of trying to work without a template is scary and it's painful. And I think it's important for organizations to acknowledge that. And I think just as important, and Jad speaks about this as well, is when you're going through periods of long uncertainty is to, and you're trying a lot of things, the brilliance is kind of being able to recognize where the innovation really is. And, and that's not necessarily easy. We need also to create a culture that encourages our talent to kind of be able to recognize that and to develop the skills. In fact, one of our producers or hosts, Stephen Dubner, did talked about some research on his Freakonomics blog, where he was talking about how, in fact, our minds are actually biased against seeing creative solutions because of the very nature of their novelty. And he quoted a study, researchers from Cornell and the University of Pennsylvania and North Carolina did a study about bias and found that we often view novelty and practicality as inversely related and that we value practical ideas a lot more. And that we need to kind of, that there's a social cost that comes with endorsing unproven novel ideas, and we have to understand that in a creative company. And they kind of concluded that perhaps it's not that we need to get better at producing creative ideas, but we have to get better at learning to identify them and accept them. And then one other thing I'll say about the creating a culture, we actually talk in our team about being chief courage officers, and it's not like we hire somebody to be a chief courage officer, but we sometimes don that role. And what does that mean? It means that somebody is owning the process of nurturing the talent and understanding what it takes to support them. It's the chief courage officer, when you're playing that role, you provide a zone of protection, kind of a thick skin when the criticism comes. kind of holding people at bay, the patience to wait things out and to drive, and the drive to keep things moving, and above all, the art of knowing when to provide which. And so the chief courage officer is making sure that innovation takes place in safety and offers courage for those further down the chain, really, who often don't feel they have the permission to break the mold. And that's, I think, real leadership. The third thing we need to do is to provide structure and skills, as I think is very much our role as managers. And we all know this, although for some people within a creative organization, it's counterintuitive. It's the 2-week sprint. It's the kind of process around creating innovation. Marissa Mayer wrote an article for Bloomberg in 2006 called "Creativity Loves Constraints," and she starts like this, and I love this. When people think about creativity, they think about artistic work, unbridled, unguided effort that leads to beautiful effect. But if you look deeper, you'll find that some of the most inspiring art forms, such as haikus, sonatas, religious paintings, are fraught with constraints. They are beautiful because creativity triumphed over the rules. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we think about managing creative talent. One of the things we did recently was turn to actually another SOM grad, I think class of '86, Nadim Mata, who runs something called Rapid Results Institute. And he leads you through these projects that are 100-day projects. And what we did is we looked at our strategic plan and looked at where we were stuck or what we wanted to do. And we put some teams together, each of which had strong executive sponsors, didn't have too many people, but were cross-disciplinary, and gave them 100 days, not to create a plan, but to do something. And we had 4 specific kind of areas. One was content creation. The other was digital for mobile devices. The third was to look differently at how we can sell our underwriting in a digital world. And the fourth was to develop new ways of thinking about membership in a digital world. And so these teams they had we didn't send them to Australia. We sent them down, to the coffee shop. This is public radio. This is what we do in public radio. And they still had to work on their regular jobs. But they loved it. And it was amazing. We created, this team that was the content creation, created 6 pilots in 100 days. And 2 of them are moving forward. The digital underwriting team raised $500,000 of new money just by saying, we're going to go do this differently. And the digital team developed an app that is really cool for a subway rider dubbed Underground, who can download and personalize their listening, and that we're going to release that next month. So it's really that process really gave us the constraints and the ability to, and the confidence, and also I think the executive sponsorship. And then I would say, lastly, it's important to always iterate. As Beth said, it's you can't. It's a whole new world, and everything we're creating now is not about getting a perfect kind of thing. And even when we're on the, well, not quite on the air, but when we're creating new stuff, you got to test and iterate and change and evolve all the time. And it's not exactly the fuck it, ship it, kind of thing of the software, but it's a little we think of as imperfection is authenticity, and kind of thinking about different ways, whether we no longer will create a 1-hour show. We're going to create segments and then figure out what works and change it. And so I think in conclusion, it is really important, I think, to think about hiring right, to think about hiring for people who can really revel in that ambiguity and offer each other the courage to set the constraints and to just think about iterating and never standing still. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Jock.
Great. Well, thank you. When you think about the very nature of what any art museum is, you of course think beginning that every art museum involves a collection. And every art museum is usually housed in a building, much as you're now today sitting in a beautiful new building. And that's certainly true here at Yale, except this is also a teaching museum, right? So when you first think about your assets in terms of creative talent as a museum director, you really, at some degree, think first of the collection itself and what it represents. And in the case of this particular collection at Yale, it represents the creative talent of people as far back as Rome and Greece and Egypt, and now at this point with 10 departments hailing from all over the world and art being made by people who are alive and very active today, and the whole span of sort of human civilization in a sense represented. And part of your job is to be a steward of that material and to keep it active and lively and accessible to whatever public or constituencies you're serving. Well, I happened to be recruited to Yale at a very interesting time when Rick Levin was still very young in his tenure. I had been running the Addison Gallery of American Art at my alma mater, Phillips Academy, which was a great teaching museum at a high school, rather a unique situation. It was founded in 1931, which was basically 100 years after Yale was founded as the first art museum in America. Most people don't know it, but in 1832, 40 years before the Metropolitan was founded, Yale opened the first museum designed by Colonel John Trumbull, who brought his paintings, designed the buildings, opened it up, and taught with him for the last 10 years of his life, and he and his wife are buried under the building. We literally have the longest artist in residence in America here at your university. But what had happened, frankly, in ensuing years is that 3 buildings were built after Trumbull's little building that was actually taken down in the year 1901 for Yale's bicentennial. And when I arrived in 1998, Rick Levin had authorized a major master planning of Yale's entire arts area and had asked the deans and directors to start meeting monthly to decide what needed to be renovated, rebuilt, or built anew, and to provide leadership for that. And at the same time, I think many of you who know Yale well, particularly from earlier years, will remember that President Levin was very intent on improving the overall collegiality of not just the faculty and students, but the relationships of the faculty and students, the management and professional employees, and Yale's clerical and technical unions, which had been locked in terrible labor disputes forever. And for the first time, we were on the verge of having a contract without a strike at Yale for you old timers, which has now happened twice. So there was this sense that our charge, not just me as director, but as deans, that we were to manage a whole sense of how our, particularly the great strengths of Yale's arts assets could be managed for the greater use and enjoyment of our faculty and students, not simply from art and art history or music or drama or architecture, but for the greater good of the whole university. So at the same time, there was this notion of deferred maintenance many of you may have heard about. These 3 buildings, I've passed out the little card that has our picture of our 3 buildings that have been renovated. The Street Hall was opened in 1866 during the Civil War. Just started during the Civil War. In 1928, the Swardow building was opened, and the Louis Kahn's first building was opened in 1953. If you do the math, that's 280 years of deferred maintenance since any 3 of those buildings had been renovated. So all of us who worked in the gallery, including the deans, had to start thinking from every position of who was working there, how would we manage these beautiful buildings, bring them back to life, how to make, as Rick Levin said, the challenge of making the collections more readily accessible and fully accessible to Yale and the New Haven community and the world at large. Because frankly, simply saying that you own this stuff, what does that mean? If the art isn't actually before you, if you're not actually engaging original works of art, what is the actual cultural transaction that's going on? And I've got to tell you, most museums that cannot make their collections accessible are now starting to have real problem with donors who don't want to just give stuff that goes in storage. So our mantra became how to make the collections more readily accessible. And also in the year 2000, as Yale approached its tercentennial, we really rethought the notion of what a teaching museum should be. And we thought we really needed to empower the creative talent of our students and our faculty and our staff much more fully, to understand what that might mean to them, and to think that in the sense of who might be able to teach with art, organize it, curate it, and work in all departments, that students, frankly, were going to be our greatest partners in this. We now actually have 161 students working in the Yale Art Gallery. The staff was 68 full-time students in 1998. We have 147 full-time employees now, but there are more students working in the gallery than there are actually staff members. And so that, how to involve them, what kind of programs to evolve in this time we've been working the last 15 years together really became quite similar to some of the things the 2 of you have described. A lot of it had to do to hiring people well, but a lot of it had to do with trusting students and colleagues and faculty members and staff members to think about what this might mean to make the collection more readily accessible. What it might mean if we were to retire our sort of retired docents, who were basically elderly people who were the traditional guides around the museum, and to ask undergraduates to think of how to give guided tours of the collection that would be informed by their own research and knowledge, how to get graduate students who are interested in teaching to teach from original works of art from the collection. Over and over, ideas came forward, and much as you've described in your for-profit and nonprofit businesses, we too started to think then of who to hire and what kind of resources to provide to undergird these smart and talented employees and students, and so that not only that a good idea would come to be, that would not be wasted by not being able to be implemented. I can't say enough that I think that the role of any leader or CEO or department head is to always harvest the best ideas and then provide the resources to the people who are working with you so that they can do this work and do it in a wonderful way and protect it and encourage it and do all the things you were just talking about that I agree with so fully. So that's something that we've really spent a great deal of time on during these recent years. And like you at Public Radio, one of the things we found is we started to really renovate these buildings and make provisions so that they could be used for a broader sense of disciplines at Yale. Is we created what we call curators of academic affairs, and their job is primarily to look at the entire Yale curriculum, what all of you are teaching, and we now have professors in this school who are coming and teaching and wanting us to work with them, not only to have artworks here, but to teach from the gallery. What might be in their teaching that could be augmented by a direct exposure to original works of art or the curators and educators who work with me. So that's been great fun to do that. And over this last year since we reopened, we now have 162 Yale courses using the Art Museum's collection, which is just a huge growth in usage. And the usage is so different in many ways that it brings you new perceptions and ideas of how this work that people have made over time, what informs it. I mean, if you stand in front of it and just talk about and look carefully at what's being done, things start to reveal themselves. People often forget that the artwork itself is an expression that if you just look at it is a little different than the use of verbal language or written language. Artists who are expressive put things in a way that if you give it some real time and slow down, spend sometimes an hour or a half hour just in front of a single painting, much more will come. And I'm not saying this against the world of apps and iPhones and everything, but the youth of today are having to balance this tremendous sense of what to do that involves quick, nimble attention versus deeper engagement and focused sense of time and looking and thinking. And I think an art museum in that regard has unique things to offer. So part of what we've been doing is really inviting other creative talent from entirely across Yale University to come to our museum, in a sense, participate with us. And then, of course, the other thing that's been really important is that this has long been a service and a museum that's free and open to anyone, and particularly to the New Haven public schools and other universities and schools throughout Connecticut and abroad. So we've welcomed those people, and at a place like Andover and Yale, frankly, you never can say enough that this place is open and free and you are welcome, because people don't necessarily always feel they're welcome to Andover or Yale. These elite institutions, and let's face it, we are elite institutions in the best sense of the word, need to be constantly generous in stating that what we have is here for the benefit of the greater good and all. So I have to tell you, it's been a remarkable joy to work on this. And part of what we've done also that I think is really important is to constantly gather our staff together. I do a lot of what I call walk around to management. I spend as much time encouraging my guards, my custodians, all kinds of people, not simply my core team, or my great patrons, that their work is valued. And I think that's the other thing about it, really, when it talks about really managing creative talent. If someone were to walk into the Yale Art Gallery and the whole building looks dirty and not well kept, it starts to degrade the overall visual beauty of this architecture and the collections. If the guards are gruff and grumpy, as many are in some museums I know, you're not so happy. And your curators are not necessarily out there on the front line greeting the public. So a lot of employees I would say some curators or directors don't think about that carefully, are the actual people your students and visitors are meeting. So why not spend enough time to really make them feel that what they're doing is important, to help them with knowledge that can make the mission and the values of the institution better known as people come to learn and enjoy what you have. And just finally, I'd say since we're here at SOM, we've recruited from this student body. I've got Jessica LeBay sitting in the front, who's my deputy director for finance administration. We have Josh Chuang, who's our curator of photography. We are recruiting, and as you say, you want to hire well, and we've started these young people as interns often in our museum, and years later they're rising to positions of great leadership. So that's something else, is we're in the business of training, identifying leadership potential, and proud as ever when our students move up to become leaders in their field in any aspect of cultural and intellectual life. So I'm pleased to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jock. I should have said explicitly that the starting point in managing creative talent is hiring from SOM. Going beyond that to other
We won't stop.
Jeremy.
So when we think of creative talent, our minds almost automatically leap to the great creative geniuses, often artistic geniuses, a Leonardo da Vinci, a Meryl Streep, Norm Foster, who designed this beautiful building. And for the younger set, the fourth one is Lady Gaga. And when we think of applying that level of genius in the business world, we think of creating these extraordinary products and services. And this is where huge amounts of attention in the corporate life gets devoted. And we call it innovation with a big I, really to enforce the importance in those institutions of this kind of innovation. The problem is, and we're not against geniuses, and I love my iPad, but this kind of innovation distracts significantly, we believe, from a much more important source of innovation that we call small I innovation. So Clasco tomato sauce, very, very popular, very, very profitable product made by the H.J. Heinz company. You can't see the innovation in here, but this used to be made with big chunks of tomatoes and made a ton of money for the company. But a factory worker at one point noticed that the big chunks clogged up the machines, created downtime, cost about $250,000 a year, which out of the size of this profit base is chump change. But Heinz took that seriously. They worked on it, made some discoveries, and determined that if they used smooth sauce, not only would they save $250,000, customers preferred it. If you Google this now, you'll see it's sold with the tagline, "Smooth, Mom." Now, you may think that every company does this kind of innovation all the time, so it's not all that interesting. And at one level, you're right. But here's the interesting part. This was just one of 1,000 ideas that Heinz developed in a 100-day period, and we also believe in 100 days, in a 100-day period, and the impact of all those ideas on this $750 million business in profits was, wait for it, $250 million to the bottom line. There is no iPad equivalent in their field that could have generated anything close to this. So the question is, how did the century-year-old company suddenly have this explosion of innovation? Well, the answer is what they decided to take seriously was using all the talent and creativity that's really the most unused asset in any company, and that's their people that are already there. So Jim, you asked us, what does creative talent look like? This is what it looks like. It looks like everybody who walks through the door every single day, from the CEO down to the factory line worker. And it gets summed up, our view of this and our client's view of this gets summed up in a quote we love that the former CEO of Hewlett-Packard, Lou Platt, said, which is, if only HP knew what HP knows, we'd be 3 times as productive. But the problem is you can't turn hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of employees into a creative enterprise just by saying, what are your ideas? You can't just use a suggestion box. So this says, suggestions will be glanced at and dismissed with an explosive snort. And indeed, my co-CEO, Terry, who's sitting over there, and I were in the room when the factory worker mentioned this, and it was dismissed initially with an explosive snort by the brand manager, who knew they had a great, recipe. So what do you need to do? Well, what you need to do is think about the fact that even though the people closest to the work and closest to the customers have a lot of insights and ideas and data and knowledge that they want to share, there are all these human behaviors, corporate behaviors, that actually get in their way. So you have to take those behaviors very seriously. And they can be bundled into basically 5 conditions. And these are the 5 conditions. And if you glance over them, you will see they are very prosaic. There is nothing very interesting about them. Well, we're in a classroom, and we grade people at schools. Well, Terry and I like to ask executives if they would grade themselves on these conditions. And they do. And they tend to give themselves basically Bs. Sometimes an A, sometimes a C. but essentially Bs. And so on average, they're B. What does that mean to them? That means we could be better, we know we could be better, we know we could improve, but we're not facing a behavioral crisis, except that the average is the completely wrong metric, as I'm sure every SOM student here immediately realized. The right metric is yield, because you have a big idea pipeline and there's leakage all along the ways that these behaviors are not helping the situation. And when you think of this as yield, now you're suddenly at 35%, a horrible failing grade. And it explains why so many organizations tap so little of the talent that they have on board. And it turns out it's not that hard to move from a B to an A. And when you move from a B to an A, as our clients have discovered, suddenly the yield goes up, a little coincidentally, about 3 times as Lou Platt predicted. So how do you move from a B to an A? Well, there's a lot of behaviors that need to be talked about, and I will only touch on a very few of them to give you a flavor. But the first one, and I love this story. I got this from my father, and in fact, I think my parents may be watching this on the internet, which is sort of cool. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Funding Yale worked out. So there was a factory in Hawthorne, Illinois in the 1920s and 30s that made little relays. And these relays had, you see rows and rows of women wrapping wires around spindles, very painstaking work. So they sent out a time and study scientist, early kind of productivity consultants. And they had lots of hypotheses, but one obvious one was it was dark in the factory. So the guy said, well, let's try increasing the lighting and see if that doesn't increase productivity. And they increased the lighting and productivity went up. But being a good little scientist, he said, now I'm going to lower the lighting from what it had been. Productivity will go down. I'll get a nice, tight R-squared fit. So he lowers the lighting and productivity goes up. So why is that? Well, because it turns out that the light bulbs in the ceiling were not nearly as important as the managerial spotlight of being watched. For the first time, these women were being watched every activity, every day, being counted every which way. So one of the things that Heinz did was to use the extraordinary power of the CEO and the executive team to shine a very bright light on all of these teams. And that, you can imagine, changed that motivation condition quite significantly. Now let me take another one, having also to do with motivation. We once heard a guy say to us, I don't work better under pressure. He said, no, I only work under pressure. Deadlines are critical. And just think about how you behave 2 days before you go on vacation. You are undoubtedly the most productive person in your organization during those 2 days. So one of the things you can do is the clever use of very short deadlines to focus people while they're still carrying on their normal business to focus on these small innovations. Now, let's talk about the vexing issue of cross-collaboration. Why don't areas and companies work well together? It's not because they don't like each other, though sometimes they don't. It's because over time they have developed very strong histories and perspectives and opinions about how the world works. And then every future discussion gets embedded in conflicts that are caused by these different points of view. Which is why we love this quote from Senator Patrick Daniel Moynihan, who said, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. So what we do is make sure that the teams that are going to be working on problems are developing a single fact basis before they even try to solve the problem, and that they are presenting not one guy to the CEO and another person to the CEO, and the CEO has to play judge and adjudicate between these two different competing worldviews, but rather a single fact-based view. And when they do that, a lot of these conflicts actually dissipate and collaboration becomes much easier. Now, one last one I'll just touch on is there is nothing that kills innovation faster than slow, bureaucratic, PowerPoint-driven, long meeting, decision-making processes. And you can just imagine people, particularly toward the bottom of the organization, who say, oh my God, The head of the branch wants to know this fact, and IT's nose is going to be bent out of shape if they're not in the meeting, and HR always has to be informed. And the new guy's got 15 things. I mean, it's mind-numbing. So what's the easiest? So if you were to ask people in an organization to draw for you the flow chart of the decision-making that they've faced, if they draw anything that looks like this, you've got a problem. And the easiest way, now the reason decision-making is so hard in so many companies is because they're asked to make hard decisions, right? Oh, it's a $50 million bet, it has all these risks, there's all these constituencies involved, it's a hard decision. So what's the easiest way to make fast decisions? Have easy decisions to make. So when Bill Johnson was the CEO of Heinz, was trying to decide whether to build a world-class kitchen, a research facility, that took a lot of time and effort because a lot was involved. You know how long it took him to approve the smooth sauce? It took him 30 seconds. Terry and I were in the room when he approved 100 of these in a half hour. Why? Customer likes it, saves money, easier to make, and everybody in the company is already lined up and says, yes, we should do that. So by changing the definition of, or the focus of what creativity should be about, you can radically change the speed of decision-making, which becomes a virtuous cycle of reinforcing, oh yeah, I'll get in this game because something might actually happen. So just to end, maybe you should have been more clear when you told the employees that they should get more creative. So with that, just to sum up, we believe that the most unused asset in every organization are the talent and people that are already there, and that if we change the nature of what we ask them to create about, you can drive these huge numbers of ideas that cumulatively will have a greater effect on the entity than anything else they could be doing. And I won't talk about it now because I'm over time, but during the Q&A we might be able to talk about, well, so how does that work in a knowledge worker setting such as a university? Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to all four panelists. And we want to have opportunity for Q&A, but before we do that, I just want to give the panelists a chance to kibitz one another or disagree with anything that they heard one of their colleagues articulate. Any takers?
Sure. Yeah. So I actually am struck by the common threads that flow through our respective comments. We did not tell each other what we were going to say in advance. And, you know, given our very different contexts in which we operate, the importance of talent, the opportunity that exists with every worker contributing to improve the core business, the importance of decision-making and nurturing a culture that fosters this, fast iteration. I mean, there was a lot of tapping into different perspectives to unleash creativity. I thought it was an interesting amount of commonality across a set of conversations that have very different contexts.
Great. Well, I want to open it up for questions. I've been asked to kind of just reiterate a few ground rules. First of all, Jeremy's parents will not be able to hear the question unless you press the microphone button in front of you and hold it down throughout your contribution. So for our friends who are participating remotely, if you do have a question, please, or a comment, please make it while you're holding down the microphone button. Questions? Yes, this gentleman in the front, please.
Very interesting questions or comments. I have, I guess, a question about the implications of the strategies that were described in the first two presentations for two items. One is a career within the company, okay, which wasn't really something discussed. What was focused on is sort of the cycle of innovation, producing a particularly new product, right? But presumably, the people in your organization are staying for a long time, and I'm just wondering whether the concept of a career or the way careers are managed are different as an implication of the approach that you take to innovation. And perhaps as a corollary to that, does the approach have implications for how the organization describes and prepares people in positions that would normally be called management?
Well, I'll take the first one. Excuse me. In terms of a career, I do think it's very different in some ways than it was 10 years ago. First of all, we're a much larger organization than we were 10 years ago. I think but what that means in terms of within this kind of context of a rapidly changing digital environment and creative environment is, in particular on the editorial side, we have a lot of different points of entry, and then we also have a lot of different ways to move people into either kind of experimental projects, like go off and spend. We have one of our reporters who was covering the de Blasio election, who really wanted after that to try her hand at a new podcast. So we're giving her 6 months to do that. The election's over. She's doing that. She's just herself and with others kind of seeding the idea in a lot of different existing places within the organization, and then we're going to reassess in 6 months. We kind of wouldn't do that. She loves it. It's a way to give her visibility and a zone of kind of creativity. Other people, frankly, have left the company but continue kind of being contributors, doing freelance work. And I think also there are ways to move up that there never were before, or move around because we need the skills of people who have been through the process of innovation to then lead and be the chief courage officers.
Other thoughts?
I can comment on the other part of the question.
Well, I wanted to just say in terms of careers, when you're in a university, a place like this, you have this double thing going on where I've been here roughly 16 years now. You have 4 academic full careers of Yale College students at 4 years each in that time. If you're in the PhD program, you've got 2, maybe 7-year stints. So one of the interesting things about being a professor, dean, or director of museum or curator is that you're often here for a much longer period of time, but a big part of the people you're engaging with and encouraging to learn and have ideas to participate in the institution are here. Their quote career academically is short, and then you want them to go out into the world and become leaders and take those attitudes and things with them. And I think one of the most important functions we have, in addition to encouraging that a good idea can come from anywhere in the organization, which is something I was hearing strongly. It can come from anyone on the staff, from a custodian on up to an undergraduate freshman, and we have all of that represented now in the gallery. But that the notion of risk and failure is not something to be shied from. Anyone who goes to college or graduate school hasn't made some interesting mistakes is not going to lead a very interesting life. And I always have to remind people that no one goes home in a body bag if you hang a painting poorly at the Yale Art Gallery or your essay isn't perfect, right? So what are we afraid of in terms of risk? In terms of letting people take some chances. We don't fail in a certain sense if you roll out a product and really blow it. Our investment is encouraging a kind of intellectual risk and imagination and curiosity that doesn't always lead to an immediate result. But I don't know any time in my own career as an artist, or any artist whose work I value, where you haven't made mistakes in your studio that have led to your next breakthrough in your work. You don't simply make success on the basis of success. And that's a hard thing to sometimes drill home to people when they get to the top of these, high-end universities. That, do some things here that allow you to take chances with things now that you're safely into this part of your life, and then take that forward with you. By the way, Mr. Heinz endowed both my position and the Carnegie, and I relish my job.
So, just
for the humorist.
Yes. So, just one question on talent. One of the things that our clients tell us after they've gone through one of these things is that they never realized how incredibly deep their bench was, and the number of promotions that come out because somebody who is 6 levels below the CEO is now going toe-to-toe with the CEO and educating them and showing what they've got becomes a great calling card. And it's a very energizing kind of experience from a career point of view. Did you want to?
Beth?
Yeah, I just comment on the second part of your question around the management piece, because something I think a lot about, because the challenge we have as an internet technology company at scale is how to grow leaders, and we talked about this yesterday, how to grow leaders who have the global general management scale skills and yet have an appreciation for the kind of product and technology innovation and an understanding of how to nurture it and foster it in the organization. And if you look at the kinds of backgrounds that people in managerial and leadership roles have, they typically are on the former, the global general management scale skills, and typically don't have the latter, this sort of product and technology experience or savvy. And so it creates an imperative for leaders to really understand where innovation comes from, how to nurture it and foster it in the organization. And it requires those of us in positions to think about succession to really pay attention not only to can you run a P&L, but can you create an environment that's going to create the innovation necessary to sustain the business going forward?
Yes, Bryce.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on one of the comments that was just made about creativity and accepting a level of risk, because one of the things we commonly hear with innovation is fail early and often, and Laura, you mentioned imperfection is authenticity. But one of the things that we have in common here on this panel is leading organizations that are gold standard organizations that are regarded in a very specific way. And in some ways, I can imagine innovation is more difficult because people have higher expectations. It's not just because they're larger, more bureaucratic organizations, but because people's understanding of what it means to be NPR or each of these brands becomes crystallized. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on how you think about creativity and accepting that level of risk and pushing the envelope and trying things new while working for these organizations that people see in a very certain way.
You know, I guess it's a really good question. And I think when you're operating in this kind of environment, at least for us, it's made us be even more intentional about the kind of errors we're not going to make. We're not going to make the error of reporting the Sandy Hook disaster wrongly if we can help it. We're not going to go to air too soon. We hold, even though our competitors will, so we talk a lot about that. What will we do? What won't we do? How do you use, one of the big issues in journalism right now is how you use listener comments and, listener reports. And so it forces the kind of discussions about, so you're not going to live with that kind of imperfection if you can help it, and you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about where those bright lines are. On the other hand, you're not going to have, we've decided, it was way, way more important to get our reporter Matt Katz on the air at 10:02 on, with the Christie emails. He had 20 minutes to read them. He felt comfortable. We weren't going to produce a whole piece. So the imperfection of kind of what live radio sounds like is something that we live with much more. And so it's a really interesting question. If we would have produced, we're now working on a big health kinds of thing. We're piloting pieces, and some of them are good and some of them are bad or not so good. We're not doing a 1 hour. Excuse me. We're not doing a 1 hour thing and that we have to do every week, and it has to be perfect. We're living with that kind of imperfection.
So we take a slightly different perspective on this, which is that, I don't want to say a myth exactly, but there's a myth that big results require big risk because we're already doing all the low-risk things. That would already be done, so pushing the envelope requires this risk. But in fact, there's a huge amount of low-hanging fruit that's risk-free. It's just not generally as sexy and as cool and as, right? So if you're on the iPad team, obviously the CEO loves you, and if you're on the big diced tomato team, there must be a problem. So the goal is, in fact, not to push risk for the most part, but to find all those things that aren't risky, even if they're less sexy.
Let me jump in and say one of the things you also do sometimes, whether it's in profit or nonprofit businesses, is look beyond yourself to other institutions you respect and like and want to help. And in the sense you want to create almost a generous, more gift economy between the two. And we've always modeled and greatly admired public radio, whether it's Connecticut Public Radio, National Public Radio. So a very low-hanging piece of fruit for us 15 years ago was to go to them and say, we have a very small publicity budget, but we think most of our visitors right now in this area are listening to Connecticut Public Radio. We'd like to give you all of our money, for basically a lot of it, to just mention our programs, not so much ads, but we were part of sort of getting that whole thing going that you now see everywhere, where people just mention their names. What that did is made a lot of our donors happy, because we were circulating a nonprofit dollar twice in the community at the same time. Support for the National Endowment for the Arts and the Humanities and everything were being knocked down in Congress and making it a much more scarcity environment for nonprofits. More recently, we said, why are we're an institution that's completely free to the public. We don't charge $25 in ticket lines and everything to get in the Yale Art Gallery. Why are we even having a paid membership program, which we had, because we're basically giving it all away free anyway, except for a discount on our books. We just went to a free membership program based on your idea. We're getting, I think it's, Jessica, was it 3 or 4 times the income since July that we got before, because people like the idea that this institution is offering this freedom. And we don't have to do a whole pledge week, but now anyone can sign up for a free membership, and you'll get maybe a letter or two during the year to say, if you like what we're doing, just send us whatever amount you want. Total risk-free, low-hanging fruit.
Perfect example.
So, and those ideas crop up from, again, different people throughout the institution who are watching these things, as well as how we watch each other in the field.
I just had one comment, because in my former life experience, I completely agree with what Jeremy has said. There's remarkable opportunity for innovation and performance improvement through tapping into the knowledge of all the workers and organizations. I think our organization is kind of the poster child for the question that you asked around being a big, globally recognized leading brand that has a global technology platform. So if you tweak it, you are impacting over 100 million users at one moment in time. And so what I would say is that, and so that can, so if you want to innovate in that context, 2 of the biggest derailers for innovation would be fear and lack of trust. And to the extent that the organization is afraid and does not have very high levels of trust, that will kill innovation for the reasons that were embedded in your question. And so we work really hard to make sure that trust levels are high. And it's kind of an interesting area of focus for our company, because of course our entire business model is based on a high level of trust, because the business itself couldn't exist. And so trust is something that we focus a lot on. We measure, we survey our employees around trust and leadership. And we work explicitly and deliberately to increase levels of trust in leadership, because we know that with higher levels of trust, amongst many things that benefits, it also benefits innovation. And so we work very hard for exactly the reason that was underpinning your question, to make sure that the trust is high and that the fear of failure is low.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gentleman in the second to the last row. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for presenting. I was wondering if you could talk about, you talked a lot about employee and tapping in the employee to get innovation out, but I was wondering if you could talk about how you could use customers to tap innovation as well. Particularly Laura, you have come to our innovator class, and I was wondering how you take those suggestions and how you use them.
Yeah, so the innovator class, I was delighted to be invited by Rodrigo to come to the innovator class in April, and even more delighted to report that some of the suggestions that came out of that innovator class we are using and are working. And so it was a great opportunity. We went to the innovator class. We were thinking hard about how do we try to raise digital membership through podcasts, through downloadable audio, and in particular around Freakonomics Radio, which we were about to start. And there was a great suggestion around some branding stuff that we're implementing. There was very clear suggestions around, which seemed obvious when you think about it afterwards, but was really brilliant. I mean, you have to ask for the membership, it would be great to ask for membership in a very Freakonomics way. It has to be very much, and boy, is that show, perfectly, designed to kind of talk about, as Stephen did when he did his spot, or one of his spots was about how it is just totally irrational to give money for something you get for free. Why would you do this? And brought the listener through kind of, from a kind of rational understanding of that to, why people do things that are irrational, like give money. And we saw that really work. Yeah. So, but the bigger question, there are probably others that can speak. It is a huge, kind of opportunity to treat your customers more as partners who are helping you and beta testing and opening things up and asking people when people think you're really asking for advice and to be part of the process, they're incredibly generous. Yeah.
I'd like to follow up and say that when we were doing the programming for the renovation of our 3 buildings, we spent quite a bit of time inviting student focus groups to meet with our architectural and planning committee to give us advice, and 3 of their suggestions were incredibly important. One of the things they said is turn the whole first floor of the con building into a really welcoming lobby that's more like a large living room where we can all come and meet up with each other, our friends and parents and otherwise, and go off into the museum from there. Make that no longer a gallery, but this different kind of place. They also said expand the gallery guide program greatly so that students are there from all of the 12 residential colleges. And we all attend each other's plays, our sporting events, et cetera. If you drive that program more deeply into the residential life, you'll get many more students. And then another thing that was so logical, why we hadn't figured out, stay open till 8 o'clock on Thursday night, because a lot of people can't, get here between 10 in the morning and 5, and on the weekend they're doing other things or traveling. Extend your hours. I mean, the list goes on, but these things are right under our nose. And you could just rattle through a whole list of these things. And, I could spend a lot of time telling you of other examples. But, not to listen to your customers or your core constituents is a really foolish thing.
I'll just give 2 examples. So we, in the core eBay business, have something we call Voices. Voices are cohorts of eBay users that we literally invite in. We fly them in. And ask them questions about their experiences, how their businesses are doing, what do they need, what would improve the performance of their business. And we do that. We have multiple cohorts that come through that program. On the PayPal side, we have something that has a similar name, Voice of the Customer, which is the purpose of it is to improve our performance on behalf of customers. So we have major, as you might imagine, customer support and operations organizations. We record calls that we think are particularly poignant in a customer describing a particular pain point. And then we play those for employees. We all have access to them. We have a number we can dial into and just listen to recorded calls from customers to help identify specific areas that we need to get better. And then that information from Voice of the Customer actually gets put into a Pareto diagram that says, okay, here are the biggest pain points that we can address. And then one by one, we just start addressing them.
So just to, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just to add to this. So listening to customers for example, literally their calls is a tremendous thing to do. But just to be a little contrarian, Henry Ford famously said, if I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So you already tend to have, we do this thing called customer journey, but we don't have customers involved in doing it. We get employees to figure out where along their interactions with the customer are they probably causing pain. And you know what? They know. If you're yelled at, you pretty much know something's not good. So the trick isn't sort of getting a new source of information. The trick is using all the information that people tend to know and at least get through that punch list. Though I will say listening into calls makes things much more visceral. And people take it much more seriously than the same information on a spreadsheet, which goes, yeah, okay, fine, we're 32 out of 39. Let's move on. And I'm dying to know, yes, I'm dying to know what this woman, now she's given up.
No, she has not.
You're right, I figured 3 times was enough.
Right.
As a good consultant, I know things can freeze.
Yeah.
I am pressing
good.
So most companies, I suspect, are not as courageous or as innovative as yours. And in my experience, there are still many executives who feel that creativity and innovation happens away from the workplace. So they want to get people away for offsites. They want to do brainstorming sessions. You know, they don't know why the big ideas aren't happening. So I'm curious if you could sort of comment on that, and in your comments, perhaps embed how you would start to shift that thinking, if you think it needs to be shifted, away from that idea that the only way to actually be creative and innovative is to unplug yourself from the work itself.
Yeah. Well, I should tell you that 2 of my 3 governing board chairs don't believe in these kind of strategic retreats and plannings. They think change needs to be a dynamic daily thing within the institution, and that's how they manage very large, successful businesses. And I have other colleagues who've suggested the other, and we've tried to blend a bit of both into the culture we've created. But, you know, that's the other thing we haven't talked at all. If any of you are curious about the relationship of trustees or corporate, you know, advisors and members to us versus, you know, hired consultants. But, you know, one of the other huge beneficiaries to us of knowledge are the volunteer members of our governing board who bring their knowledge back to Yale and share it, much as these 3 alums are doing today. You know, and how do you harvest that knowledge and put it in play?
So not surprisingly, I completely agree that lots of companies think they're already doing good enough, right, well enough, that it must be that the ideas aren't flowing because they need to do something else very different, like go off-site and so forth. And frankly, it's incredibly hard to change it. You know, the famous cartoon of Pogo was, "We've met the enemy and they is us." It's very hard to get organizations who don't already have the predilection to believe this, right? We've run into a lot of CEOs who do actually already believe that they're not tapping the talent they have. But those who don't believe it, it's really hard to change. It's easier to change the CEO than to change their mind I'm just saying. But one thing that, you know, can be done is you can run little kinds of pilots and little kinds of examples and so forth to show those leaders that something spectacular doesn't happen. You just have to behave differently. Mm-hmm. You know, when we worked for the CEO of PNC, who's a very successful guy, we told him the morning that he was going to hear all these ideas from his teams, that he was going to hear a lot of ideas, that his reaction was going to be to leap across the table, throttle the person, say, "Why haven't you fixed this already?" And we said, don't do that. The first time you do that, you'll never hear another idea. Just sit on your hands and smile and say thank you. And he did that, and at the end of the day, he said, that was the best piece of advice I've ever been given. When you gave it to me, I thought you were being a little patronizing, frankly. But it turned out I did have a hard time not leaping across the table, but by not doing that, I did see all this stuff. So one way is to make people see a little piece of it at least. Because intellectually, people who aren't already of that mind, it's really hard to get them to change.
And I just add that I think offsites can be useful forums for getting senior leaders aligned. I would not be my forum of choice for fostering creativity or creative ideas. I think that a starting point, though, is there has to be some level of curiosity or awareness Absolutely. That there is some untapped potential in the organization, and the kind of creativity that Jeremy's talked about and that his firm does is an enormous source of untapped potential for performance improvement in many, many, many companies. And all you have to do is just recognize the very simple idea that the people who do the work every day know what needs to be changed. Mm-hmm. And you just have to ask them. And it's a very simple notion, but sometimes we miss the obvious. And so some curiosity around that, some awareness of that, and then obviously you need some tools to help enable it to happen. But it starts with the curiosity and the awareness that there is an untapped opportunity in the organization.
One little story comes to mind, by the way. There was a CEO who's doing an offsite with about 40 of his top folks. And normally they did a fancy dinner that nobody actually really liked, but it was in the hotel and it was stodgy. And so in order to use this offsite as a way to sort of instigate this idea of, I'm sure there's a way we could have more fun for less money, right? How can we do better more efficiently? He set up a little contest for ideas about what could replace that dinner. And so people started thinking about, well, what's the diners, drive-in dives, you know, totally unique, totally fun, cool thing of that locale, and it would save us a ton of money and we'd enjoy it more. And they ended up picking one of those and doing that. So he actually used this sort of retreat not as a fancy, though he did give an iPad to everybody, so that might have undermined a little.
I think this is really an interesting example of where some sort of non-obvious things come out of combining a couple of obvious things. So if you take the precept that customers can have enormous insights that can help create new opportunity, and if you take the precept that says innovation can come from anywhere within the organization, and you combine those, it seems like a thing that would follow from that pretty clearly is you'd like to really maximize the extent to which employees are engaged with customers. And I think a lot of organizations view the customer-facing aspect of roles as kind of given. If you're in marketing, then you're customer-facing. If you're technical, you're not. But as Josh pointed out, the people that guard museums and libraries, I worked at an unnamed institution where it was clear the librarians viewed their job as protecting the books from misuse by faculty and students, right? I mean, whether people view their job as protecting the assets or enhancing the experience of customers is something that you can actually have a pretty powerful impact on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, down in the front, please.
Can you talk about how this applies in other cultural situations, the whole SOM move to globalization, if any of you've had experience in creating innovation in cultures that might be different than the US model?
Well, one thing that I find very interesting is Stephen Breyer, the Supreme Court Justice, who's involved with bringing Supreme Court justices from other countries to Yale to talk together about law. He often, when he brings this group to campus every couple of years, they come first to the art museum and they walk around because they all come from different countries and cultures, and the first thing they do is talk about the kinds of things that were made in each other's cultures. And he uses that as the icebreaker to then start these deeper discussions, and it's a relaxed way to introduce it. I was astounded when he first came our way that way. This was quite a number of years ago, and things like that are what make you realize that there are many different ways to use even something as like an art museum collection. You'd never think of that. Well, how does that help the law school and his program? But particularly as Yale's become a more global institution, the use of the collection and the ability for students and people who come here to see themselves and their culture in those collections, which is why it's important that the collections are now global in scope and range, couldn't be more important. If you'd come to a place like Andover before it was co-ed and all you ever saw was paintings by male artists, when the place had gone co-ed and is now 23% students of color, which is similar to Yale, you'd be disappointed after a while. So that gets back to this notion that the artwork or the creative talent of what's in the institution itself needs to be reflective and informative of the people who are here. So that becomes another responsibility of curators, faculty, board members, donors who can participate in that. That too has been a wonderful part of what we've worked on in the arts area with our colleagues here.
And just to add, the mechanisms that we use to foster innovation do have to be culturally relevant and sensitive. And in our business, that has a couple of different aspects because we're a US-based global company that has for the most part, a single global platform. So people in other parts of the world aren't free in most parts of the world to just make changes and innovate because that's to come back to the global platform. And so, but we have a few markets where they are on their own platform. So for example, one of our biggest markets is Korea, and they have their own platform, so they can innovate within their organization, within their geography, and within their own cultural context. That's quite independent of the rest of the company. One example I'll give you of, so Korea can do their own thing and it's entirely culturally relevant because it's within their cultural context. But an example of innovation, actually not technology innovation, but on the HR side, we're in the process of rethinking our approach to performance management. And so we've collected a lot of information that from colleagues in the US, but wanted to get a European perspective in that. And so somebody in Europe was tasked to pull together a group of people who would basically create new possibilities for how we could do performance management for the company. What I did to kick it off, though, to I would say give permission to it and to invite it, was I kicked it off by saying I welcome it. And that was actually very important because I am the owner of performance management for the company. And we felt it was really important for people to understand that I welcomed what could be perceived as the criticism of the current performance management approach that the team would be required to bring forth. And then I basically did a video conference with them and let them each pitch their ideas, each of the teams, the little teams that came up with ideas, invited them to pitch the ideas directly to me to reinforce the message that I welcomed, that I welcomed the change. Because particularly, the bunch of people from the UK who would not naturally necessarily be so direct as to say, here's what I think you should change, but I really wanted them to feel like they were welcome to do that. So there are things that we can do with some cultural sensitivity that really invite people to innovate within the context of the multiple cultural contexts in which they operate.
So when we did this kind of work for Manpower, which is a global company, and even though it's a US-based company, most of their business is outside the US, and it grew up by buying companies all around the world, so those companies tend to be local in nature with a very sort of light touch from the US. We would hold these executive meetings in Paris with the video conferencing going on so that we'd walk around the world as each country would report in throughout the day, which meant some people were up very late at night. And what we at least have found in the kind of work that I talked about was there's almost no difference country to country or culture to culture, at least at the level we're talking. I'm not saying the cultures aren't different. I'm saying in the nature of the specific kind of work, that problem solving is the same kind of human behaviors, right? People work better under deadlines, same kind of fears that if they go to their boss and say, hey, good news, I just found out I've been wasting money over the last 5 years and I could have easily prevented that. That's usually not considered good news in any culture. So we haven't found it to be very culturally specific. But doing what you just talked about, which is having the leadership directly involved, that's essential. Because that's saying, I mean it. And I'm going to show you with my body language and my words what I really think, and not through some email, that you get.
So I've been informed by our dean that my job security is in jeopardy if this clock counts down below 00. So unfortunately.
Oh, and I have another story.
So I'd like to first thank our panelists. Certainly creativity and talent. If managing creative talent were as easy and pleasurable as it's been dealing with the four of you, then we wouldn't have needed this panel. But so I want to thank the four of you. I'd like to thank all of you for participating, and we are now officially adjourned.
Right. Thank you. Very nice. That was great.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
It was really a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun talking with all of you.
I say we do it again next week.
Yeah. No, that was great.
Thank you. You would have thought there was a method here.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Also,
It's really a lot of fun.
How much these issues blend right across nonprofit and for-profit world, which is usually one harbors tremendous stereotypes.
Yeah. People are people.
Yeah.
Very, very similar, right?
Yeah.
Ben, where is, there's a lunch for panelists?
Oh, yeah.